Hey, Chris, it's wonderful to have you here on our or my podcast today. I'm alone today. And obviously, I have it a little bit darker than you because I'm sitting in Iceland. You have been here, so you know how it is. Where are you today? Where did I
I,
meet you?
hey, it's so good to see you. I'm back home in San Francisco.
That's nice. Probably the better place to be right now.
Well, weather-wise, let's be honest, probably, yeah. I can say that as a Danish person, right? I know the Danish winter, so it's not that bad.
Exactly, exactly. That's probably also what I love about you. But actually, let's talk about a little bit what you have done, because you actually blew me away when we met some years ago, 2 years ago, or something. With your story, that's actually when I knew that I definitely wanted to spend more time. But I know that in podcasts, I always get asked exactly the same question about my story. So maybe it's interesting not always talk exactly about the same thing, but um, even though, I mean, the Netlify story where you convinced everyone of something which seemed to be, let's say, not believable for most of the people you talk to, is an interesting one. But what is the untold story about you?
An untold story about me. I've done a few of these. An untold story. I don't know. I mean, like, I'm originally from Copenhagen, Denmark. I have an untraditional background for tech, right? So I thought I was going to be a doctor when I was in high school. I realized by working as an orderly in a hospital that I shouldn't be a doctor. That was not for me. Um, Started setting up like building computers, setting up office networks, right? Just to make money, like not because this was early, right? Like dating myself, right? But this was back when a computer was you buy a PC and you built the cabinet and that was it, right? Um, I did that, by accident in a film studio, and the following Monday they were going into sort of digital editing, non-linear editing, rather than coming from film, like analog film, and so I was a little bit more of a digital native, and so I could help out a little bit, and so I started doing editing, line producing. I worked a bunch for my father, who had a company in that space as well. Back then, right? I had been out traveling for a while, and then I I ended up missing studying, so I started. I quit and I studied film and media science at Copenhagen University, and then I realized you make less money as a student uh, than you do working 90 hours a week, apparently. And so I thought like there was this new thing called Flash, and it basically supported semi-transparent alpha channels, which meant that you could take video elements and embed it into motion graphics that would run on a website. It was called rich media sites. And a friend of mine who was one of the pioneers in the space, that I got to high school with, and me, we were sort of, really excited about this. I had a feeling that my future would be online, but not exactly what it would be. Um, and um, and we started seeing these sites, other places, and we were just in a position to let's go for it. So I made this company, a hybrid production company that specialized in, it was websites, but specialized with Flash video. And when you do this, you needed a lot of loops. So instead of having like these video elements where you, like, if you do a commercial, right, it's very linear. You start at second one and you end the second 30, and that's it, right? It's one way every time for anyone who uses it. But this notion was, and it started with, computer games. Started with the notion of the free world games, the first person shooters, and then later on, the multiplayer games. This notion that it was filmic, but I could choose in a set world. There might be a set mission, right? There was certain parameters that were the same for everyone, but within that, I could sort of edit my own story, so to speak, right? Because I'm in.
So individualize the experience.
Exactly, and I liked that, right? So that was one of the things that I thought maybe I could end up doing that. And then this Flash video was tasting a little bit of the same, right? And it was fun, and I loved the technical challenge of trying to figure out how does this work, and especially from the film production, there was sort of unique requirements to make this translate well into these websites. And so we did it, but no one. This is in Denmark, right? Not exactly first movers. We were just we were doing this, but I was studying anyway, right? So hey, we'll do what we can. And then we were lucky, and the whole category just blew up overnight. And so essentially, we ended up with, I think it was 9 out of the 10 largest agencies servicing something like, a majority of the larger companies in Denmark, because everyone wanted one of those, right? And so I did that with my friend. Very quickly, we started realizing, hey, this is what I would want to do anyway with a degree. So I'm just going to drop out. And I had no time. Like, this was very quickly full time, right? So I had to choose, and honestly, it was an easy choice. And so yeah, I dropped out and I started doing this, and I did it for a number of years until I sort of felt like we were always in the tail end of the execution, right? I wish I could say, oh, I had the foresight to know that Flash was going to go crashing down, right? And I had sort of seen in the tarot cards that Steve Jobs would be saying Flash is dead, right? And everyone would run away from it, uh, like a trash fire. But the reality is that I just wanted to get closer to the strategic decision makers. I wanted to make sure that I could follow this through, and not just doing the production, but do something that would actually move market shares, right? That did its job. All of this was commercial, right? All this had, you know, the notion of conveying a story that would convince someone to do something, right? And I wasn't involved in that really, right? I was involved in trying to do great productions that could win awards in Cannes, or Clio's in New York, or Eurobests or whatever, right? And and so I sold it to a full service agency, and I became the chief digital officer as part of the merger. And that's what I was doing. So I left film behind. Um, Mostly this was sales, try to win enterprise clients together with the others, right? It was an agency that had a strong trade background. So they did a lot of FMCGs, there were a lot of in-store stuff, right? And they were trying to, they were full service, but sort of more new to the digital space, right? And so I learned a bunch. We published the largest marketing magazine in Denmark as a source of new biz by doing seminars, right? So it was an early example, and you could almost say content marketing. Well, it was content marketing, right? Which is something that fascinated me a lot and helped me a lot to wrap around Netlify, which was all about developers first.
But just to quickly breathe, it's amazing because it seems as if you always have been a little bit on the forefront of things, right? So there is an inner edge, let's say, driving you towards like being always on something new. Is it your curiosity
Yes,
or?
absolutely. No, 100%. I always try to understand the emotions, right? Of, hey, if this is happening, then what will happen next, right? If this is possible, in our world is often about technology unlocking something, what behaviors will be driven from it? And the more steps you can think out, like a chess game, that because it takes the time to get an idea, get a team, build up, and start catering something and getting traction with it, right? And so if you could get those two paths to merge, then you can be onto something, right? And I think that's what any founder does in startup world, or many at least, right? And that has always been a focus area for me, for sure. Yeah, when I was just doing it because I thought it was interesting, and later on as my job, my career.
And was that always driven a little bit by, let's say, a dream of a specific vision, or let's say?
No, I know, because the vision changes depending what it is, right? Right. The vision for Netlify, right, was absolutely a better web. Like, the Netlify story starts with another friend from high school, Matt, right? And that was really the notion of saying, hey, he was coming saying, hey, I'm building a legacy CMS, sort of a fully hosted WordPress. Everything that's happening technical, every trend for front-end developers, everything I'm building out, that's catering anything like, FTP uploads, changing to Git and so on, right? Nothing really rhymes with this technology stack. It feels like I'm building for obsolescence, and I can't shake it, right? And at that point, I'm just saying, okay, interesting, right? I don't know what to do with it, but it's interesting, right? And then as we start talking more and more, it starts sort of crystallizing that the base architecture of the web, if you forget about whether you're using this software from this vendor or this software, it wasn't a commercial play. It wasn't whether Microsoft or Apple was winning. No, it's just the base architecture of how web was built, was the notion that everything would run on a server and then built for every visitor. So it means you have a program. So if you have 100,000 visitors, you have to build a website 100,000 times. That has a lot of limitations to it in scale, in cost, in performance, and also in security. And the
But
reality
again,
is,
individualized experience, right? Like a little
mm,
bit like what you have done before.
it was an
Interesting.
individualized experience. And it was what we all called Web 2.0, and it was what enabled the Facebooks of the world. It was actually really, really cool. And it's a fun technical story. So kind of like started with a server-side hack almost, right? But it was really what made the web move to a new state, right? Which enabled us for a whole new experience economy, like it changed the world, right? But at
Exactly.
this point,
And
it's
user
not
behavior as well.
100%. But, it started leading into these walled gardens, right? Like Apple's App Store, which is great for them. But when Steve Jobs presented the iPhone for the first time as a PDF, all the icons were shortcuts to websites. The notion of an app did not exist. None, right? And it was only because pulling in the UI every time wasn't going to scale that we realized, hey, the phones aren't fast enough, broadband is, we have to do something, right? And so we came up with or they came up um, with apps, right? That were pre-built and then used the operating system on the phone as a runtime, right? And essentially at core Netlify was realizing that we need to distribute the workload as well, right? And so the browser had turned from being a document viewer, the browser being, Chrome or Internet Explorer, Firefox, or whatever it is you use on your laptop or phone to visit a website, right? Um, that had become an operating system. And so, hey, wait a minute, why don't you pre-build a site? Now you can also distribute, so you don't have a single point of origin. So it's always close to the user. Now you're solving for scaling, right? And performance is going to be quick. It's pre-built. There's no wait time. And then once you get into the browser, then you can run it. And then, hey, I need the latest prices for this, right? It wasn't part of a pre-built website. Then you pull that for what we call microservices, right? So this rhymed very much with the API economy. And really what it was the front-end developers, which I was closest to and Matt was close to, which is the ones that create the website at that point. Now we're, of course, in a new era of agents, and so I'm sure we'll get to that. But that was really the notion of, hey, exactly, right? But it was so cool because, hey, wait a minute, you can actually you can send this to like you used to have to send this to a backend developer for implementation, and you sort of, well, now it's another 3 weeks. I don't know what they do over there. It was a huge loss of time, which I felt very heavily as running, my department in the agency, right? And the notion that a front-end developer could push something live, like directly, right? It's obviously changing the whole nomenclature, right? And the front-end developer is no longer what we would have thought of a few years before, but still, that to me was incredibly excited. And our headline was, that enables the web to find back. And then, of course, from there on, it was all about an ecosystem, because any service that already existed, let's say e-commerce, would have to not be a monolith, but a headless API. So that's another chapter, right? But that was really that was the vision, right? It was really a vision of building a better web, because otherwise we're going to be locked into walled gardens where someone else gives you permission to publish or not.
Amazing. So it's always the question of like, okay, what is next, as you said, right? The curiosity you bring into this to understand, to learn. But I would say probably a lot of founders who haven't done the journey as often as you and me, and they ask themselves, like, how do you know? Like, what is inside you? What gives you actually this confidence to you feel this very strong, like, yeah, that's it. What is the inner edge there for you?
I think it's a very, very good question, right? And it's, I think, for any startup founder, the most central one, right? It's doing diligence on your own idea, right? And I think for me, there's so many elements in it, right? So one thing is what you're building. And I think a big challenge for a lot of founders is that you very quickly become in love with your solution. You do start with a problem, but then you're all about the solution. And then the problem's sort of over here, but this solution, right? And then you
It's a
build,
love story. The first 3 months are always good, you know?
yeah, but you end up building something that might remove itself a little more and more from the problem you're trying to solve, right? But it's all
Yes.
about the solution. And I deal mostly when I advise people, or when I'm myself doing fundraising, for example, right? Where the typical way of doing it is spending a lot of time on your solution and not a lot of time on what's adjacent to the solution. What's the ecosystem going to look like, and how's that developing in the problem space as well, right? How are you solving that? How does that develop? And I feel like that's almost always underserved in pitches, right? And so, or I think like of the work leaning into a pitch, for example, right? But also very often in early startups, right? So having your eye on the ball as far as understanding what you're trying to solve for, I think is really important. Also, as no initial idea stays pure, right? Like in a way, I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that you will learn so much in your discovery that you feel, oh yeah, the base insight is true, but hey, we should be doing this, or we should be doing that, and so on, right? And so as that evolves, you have to keep revisiting if you're still solving the right problem and what does that mean, right? And so I think that's a notion that translated in for me, for example, let's take Netlify, right? I understood what Matt was coming with. But for me to really do diligence here, I started by saying, okay, let's assume that this decouplement and what we wanted to build in it, let's just put that to rest for a minute. Let's put what we want to build to rest. Let's talk about if this happens, if this technical, because it's a very technical story, right? Like you zoom out a little later. But in the beginning, it's very sort of, hey, if we do this, that would enable this, and I think that will be cool, and so on, right? And people seem to be wanting it, and so on. But I think for me, it was this notion: how do you zoom out? How do you, if this happens, what else happens, right? So let's say we wanted to decouple the front end, right? We wanted to have a distributed CDN made optimized for small files and so on, right? But I feel that would still have been a little bit of the wrong place to start. So we talked about if we decouple this, right? If the front end is separated from the back end, let's just assume that that's viable. What else would necessarily have to happen and happen? And one thing that became really obvious was that all these services would have to be re-architected. We needed headless CMSs and headless commerce and a bunch of other things, right? It would redistribute digital departments, because before you might have a few front enders and a huge back end team, right? I remember an Earl in Portland agency and the tech lead there, he had 35 guys and 3 front enders and 35 and 32 back enders, I think it was, right? Or 31 and then him. And then over a few years, it flipped. It was vice versa, right? Because now all these people could just produce their own things, right? And so we sort of just mapped it out. Obviously, that also led to the insight that you couldn't go and sell this to enterprises right away, because an enterprise is going, well, let's say I want to do an e-commerce site. We're like, yeah, well, you can't do that yet because there's no e-commerce solution that supports this, right? And so this was really good at understanding, okay, the potential of this is gigantic. There's a huge shift. There's a giant ecosystem. There's all the money you could imagine, right? It is a big one, right? It's not a small thing. And it understood, what does the ecosystem have to look like? So that when you start reverse engineering it, it became obvious, well, we're not going to be building an e-commerce service, or we're not going to do this, or we're not going to do that. And so we could sort of come down to, well, that sort of developer enablement, it has to start with developers anyway. It has to start with empowering these front-end developers, because they necessarily has to take the first step. No one's going to make a headless e-commerce when there's no infrastructure or workflows or anything to support it. They're going to stay with what they have. So that way of really trying to figure what will happen at scale, reverse engineer that, and understand how do those, like think of it as a ring ladder, right? What comes first? And so that could sort of trace us back to saying we have to start with the developers and they have to be enabled in this way. And then we could see, well, what's too much for us and where can we have the most impact in this? And that's actually what defined, that we did CDCI as part of that, where you can just push to get, and that's what everyone does, right? But if you, in that notion, like the notion of a deploy preview didn't exist, though, something we invented, right? Like this notion, you could just push your code to get, and then, which is version control in the cloud, and then there are no more steps. Everything from there is automated. Those were the things we knew we needed to do. We knew we needed to do this CDN, so to speak, which is a content delivery network, which is distribution of your files, so laying copies all over the world, but not for media files, which was the default back then, but for small files, because we had to do it with the actual website itself, with HTML. And those were sort of the insights that came from thinking this as big picture as you want, as saying, what are the Fortune 500 going to do, and what is it going to be for the departments and so on. So I actually think that understanding the details and prioritizing those are much easier if you've really done your homework of trying to play it out and reverse engineer it. And so, of course we make mistakes in Netlify and we got some things right and so on, right? But the general development of what was going to happen, we were actually surprisingly spot on, even over a decade. Um, but I really think that had to do with spending all that time in the diligence. And it meant that someone like me that was nowhere near as technical as Matt could really wrap around it and understand this. And also, okay, we have to do developer marketing. What does that mean? Which is a whole other chapter, but that's where my content marketing days came into play. So
I love it. And I especially love this evolution of like your core, let's say, approach always to go always like in your heart with this question, what's next? So I am just so curious now. Can't stop myself from asking. So what is next actually in Netlify, even though you're not there anymore? So maybe you give us a quick, let's say, and like how you left Netlify and what's the outlook though for that business, because I think it's very interesting. It will shape our user nature, so to say, for the next 10 20 years, I think. And then we go to who you are today.
absolutely. First of all super proud of the team, right? I stepped out a year and a half ago. It's a question of like, I love the 0 to 1 space, right? And at that point, Netlify had fast 5 million developers. We had, um, we saw that the category had become like, even if you have agents today, for anyone non-technical following along, like or the less technical, right? Like the notion of 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 decoupling the web, as I talked about, right? This notion of distributing runtime and not having traditional monoliths, like no one builds that way. It doesn't matter if they use Netlify or not. Like that has become completely default, right? There are thousands of companies. It's not even a question of how many companies are in the category, because it's just that's how it's built, right? Like so that became, we coined the term of Jamstack back then to have something as an umbrella term that everyone could work under. That became quite big at the time. And that has become, no one talks about it anymore because it's just default, right? Like it's just like when the first shift, when we started talking about dynamic websites, very quickly, that was the only way to build websites. And you scratch the dynamic part, it's just a website, right? And but for me personally, when I felt, okay, I've been hammering at this for a long time, I love learning. That's my primary driving force. I think it's why I'm also trying to always look forward. And so I felt like, okay, now is a good time for me to step back. I think Netlify had a new chapter, which was all of a sudden AI came in, and it's still coming, right? And it's hugely different. And so what we could see was that target audience that was new for the first time around, which was front-end developers that used to just cut out Photoshop files and turn it into HTML and ship them off. Like that's where that story started, just to remind anyone, right? And like,
I make money like that, so I know very well how it is. My first project in university, so I know it.
fantastic. And so like it became really evident from our own numbers that agents were going to be the new users, right? And so that meant that you have, in our time, the number of what we, potential developers out there, the market grew, right? But now it's gone from, I don't know, 70 million or something to 1.5 billion, right? Because anyone can go and prompt their website. But the thing is that these agents, they're going to exist in infrastructure, right? They're going to exist inside enterprises that already have tons of different services and so on, right? And so Netlify really worked on coining the term agent experience, right? Which is becoming a really big thing today. I think it's just because it's very important. So we went from developer experience to agent experience. And so Netlify sort of went all in on catering all those different agents that use the prompt. So now they're sort of the default platform from that, which also resulted in 5 million developers after the first 10 years. And today we just passed 10 million.
So is there a question, are you kind of like also proud of like touching? I mean, you're like with your work, you're touching so many people. Isn't that insane?
Yeah, it's so much fun. I mean, I love when I go and do something new, when I'm talking about new business or something else than doing. that, I can always say, oh yeah, by way of some intro, help create Netlify. Oh, we use Netlify. Right? It's kind of fun, right? Like, oh, yeah, let's like get common into.
To be honest, I think that's so much more worth even, than talking about billions you make in revenues or money raised, but like really like touching people, in their day-to-day work and really shaping their work experience is crazy, I think.
Yeah. It's super fun, right? And Netlify, I've always seen it as an enabling layer that you brought your favorite tools to. And sometimes that's a challenge because that tool can be, if it's back in the day, it was a JavaScript framework. Now it's changing to be an agent and so on, right? And so they have the initial touch with the user. But we've always said, hey, we're going to be not just catering that one tool that you want to use, but we want to be Switzerland. We believe that's going to be many different kinds of agents. And if we can be a common sort of enabler and infrastructure provider for that, and I don't mean infrastructures that we come with metal, right? But just as we make everything plug and play and give you all the observability and everything an agent needs to take their creation experience and scale it for enterprises and integrate it into all kinds of systems and so on, right? And just make it work. And that was the notion when we started. Netlify's notion. There was a vision of building a better web, right? And then the notion was that we're going to make it easy. And that's still it, right? And it's just translated to a very new stack, and it means a lot of changes, but it's the same thing, right? And so now you have a lot of users that don't necessarily know that Netlify is behind the scenes powering all of this, but that doesn't matter because the enablement is still there, and that's the fun part, right? Making things happen, having an impact. So yeah, it's I'm super proud of the team. I'm still connected. I still sit on the board, right? And doing great work, and it's really fun to watch this develop.
Amazing. So now I think it's a good timing for my next question. I know that you have been a very hands-on founder, especially I think we can feel that passion out of you coming and this like, okay, I'm on this stuff deeply. So you were like this do-it-all founder, let's call it like that. And now I know you have been more developing, so to say, or being interested into ecosystems, into strategies, into understanding also like where the world goes. So what's next in the world?
Yeah.
And I think that's quite exciting to hear. So what are you thinking in that terms?
Yeah.
What is next?
So after Netlify, because that Netlify was such an ecosystem play, right? And we even ran a Jamstack innovation fund, invested into companies. As soon as I could, I started angel investing. I think all the way back in 2017, I started doing that. And so exiting Netlify, I sat on a larger number of advisory boards, executive boards, and a ton of angel investments, right? Just we have been pushing it forward. And I started being exposed to things outside of the web economy, doing, some advisories to different universities in Europe and so on the entrepreneurship side of things. And I started really enjoying that as well, because there's so much to learn. Like, I don't know anything about batteries, right? And it's just so much fun. But there might be insights that I can still provide, because the difference between a technical insight, a product and a business, a scalable business will still sort of apply itself, right? Even across quite different disciplines. So I had a lot of fun doing that. But you're right.
Even computing on the moon.
Yeah, still doing that one. Yeah. That's a few steps of getting there. Few steps. But it's fun. Yeah. But I also got itchy fingers, right? And one of the things that I'm now working with, like, it started with sort of the notion of LLMs have traditionally been good at speaking about what's there, but not so much about what's not there yet, right? And there's a number of reasons for that, right? One of the things is it suffers a little when it comes to sort of complex reasoning and like there's a whole other series of podcasts that diving into the nitty-gritty of it, right? But it was, of course, I was thinking a lot about what is AI, what's next for it. And a lot of those things comes with any founder of like, what would you like to see, right? And there was I'd love to be able to speak to Netlify as an entity, right? And what would that mean? A mix of deterministic and probabilistic model. And I was speaking to a guy that is a co-founder now that I've known for a long time. And he said, well, I think a lot of those things have to do with understanding change over time, right? And there's not a lot of time-based information in there, and that's going to inform these LLMs to make better decisions. And I think what we also
Maybe
have an understanding of,
luckily, I know exactly what you're talking about. Feeling very honored with my role here. But maybe you explain this quickly, like in an example for everyone listening to, because I think that's rather more
So
complex.
exactly.
Yes.
So I think like the evolution of AI, right? And we call it, like, this is from the helicopter point of view, right? And that was where I felt like I'm leaning in the right place, because I think regardless whether it's robots or prediction markets, like polar market or whatever it might be, it's the notion of simulating outcomes and making the right decision, right? Um, and being able to act from it, right? It kind of makes sense, right? And so might be very good at analyzing the past, and that's also good for statistical reasoning and finding patterns and try to predict things. But still, like, the notion of simulating outcomes and decision making is an area of improvement. The better that is, the better the closer we get essentially to AGI, right? And so that has many different parts of it, and one of them is being able to understand change over time better. Another was a specific kind of reasoning that just extends itself better to very complex prediction tasks. And that is less about should I make a left or right, but that's more sort of about, well, how likely when is the federal shutdown of the government going to end, for example, like where you say, well, there's almost an infinite number of parameters. And so one thing is collecting those, right? But another thing is prioritizing and reasoning about them and so on. And so I started with two guys there leaning into that space quite heavily, right? Of figuring out what should we be doing here, how could we push this forward, and ended up sort of looking at doing a new way of reasoning. And that's something that we ended up being so good at prediction that we now create a company around it. That is going to be sort of still in stealth, right? But it is going to be sort of more of a hybrid between a Silicon Valley and a Wall Street company, which is very, very exciting. I feel it's a little early to share too much of it, but I think from a headline here is that AI is the evolution. I feel like it's a minute ago that in a practical manner, it was saying, okay, whatever we get manually from this API, we can now automate. Great. It's one more abstraction. Really just felt like abstraction is so easy to do, but I need hands to do it. And now someone does it for me, right? Great. And then so quickly it's evolving, right? And so, like today, give us access to firmware updates, Slack messages, Salesforce CRM. Like, the more input you have, the more nuanced your feedback will be, and so on, which is also, of course, a huge issue, because you have all these startups wanting ultimate access, and you have all these companies on the other side saying, hey, wait a minute, I thought our moat was selling these things that we produce. It turns out that it's actually the data, right? And so let's be careful of who gets access to that. Because that's really what's worth something going forward into this world, right? And so there's a few, I don't know, I would also say there's some tension in there, right? Like where there's two big motions that pull in each separate direction. But regardless, I think it is so interesting that AI is touching more and more and more, right? We also just saw Moltclaw come out, right? And you can now use an assistant; it can basically do anything, right? Um, but also in this specific way of something that has been extremely human, right? Our intuition, our way of doing judgmental forecasting and decomposing problems and how we can hold apples and oranges in our heads and almost intuitively or subconsciously pull in so much different who's going to be president. Well, I think he looks a little pale. My friend stopped talking about that. It's not even like you're consciously doing it. You're thinking about, what do I remember about the polls in the last thing I saw? And someone stops on the street and asks you this, and you pull all this together and say, I think it's going to be this, but I'm not sure, right? But that process is almost very organic, right? It's not something that extends itself easily to ML learning. And that's an area that I sit with now. And we're really making huge strides forward, where we can translate it into something like, how often are we right when we predict something, right? That's very complex. And we're now sort of beating human super forecasters and so on. So it is really.
So you're building a brain. You're building a brain.
Yes, we're sitting a little bit trying to build a crystal ball. But I was also, without going into too many details, I was sort of saying that's one aspect of the evolution of AI that I have sort of doubled down in, and that I find incredibly interesting.
I mean, I love, and you know it, your focus on the topics and you're learning in it, and this it's still always the same question of what is next. However, how did you, as Chris, change over time? Like, are you different, Chris, now in your business than you were in your first agency? Like, what is the main difference for the end? That's the last thing I need to know. And then
No, I think that's a fair question. It's I've tried a few things considering that I'm only 29, right? But
as of 19, come on, you look 19.
oh. No, but I've part of what I've done that's the same, but that just became hopefully a little better over time is storytelling, right? Like it's how do these pieces fit together? How do you create a narrative around it that could convince others to join my mission or maybe help fund it or whatever, right? Or how can I identify this for others or help others saying, hey, like you have great insights, but like you need to get this into a cohesive thing. So whether you're informing your roadmap or your audience or your investors, right? Or would-be investors. And I think like the storytelling aspect is something that I felt has been with me from the very beginning, and of course just has specialized more in a world of entrepreneurship. But it's still with me, right? Like it's still what I did, right? And then I think other things that evolved was I think in the notion in the beginning is that I have to be good at everything, right? So I better, right? Oh, okay, success, you have to be the CEO, you have to do this, you have to do that, right? And then I realized over time, it's like, oh, that's completely misunderstood, right? Like, you should do what makes you happy and what you're really good at and where you bring a lot of insight and a lot of push forward, right? And then you should just find fantastic driven people that are really good at things that you necessarily aren't. There has to be a sufficient overlap often, right? Because you need to speak a similar language, but still, right? And I'm not just talking in a hiring process. I also mean in like founding. Like for example, I wouldn't want to be a solo founder. Like I have no interest. I don't want to be alone. I want to be back to back with someone that have the exact same incentive as I do. Otherwise, it's no fun, right? Like, hey, this has to be something we do together. And so I think like the evolution of what success would look like has changed for me, right? So today I think I'm much more sort of mellowed out in certain areas, right? And just have a lot of focus. And it's fun because it turns out, at least to me, that the answer is that I should spend more time doing what I really like, which happens to be very often what you're very good at, and less time on the other things, right? Hey, that's great, man, right? And so, like, you can actually be successful without having to be someone that does it all, for example, right? Like you have the so like without going into that, but you have the Steve Jobs of the world and so on that had some profiles, and I think a lot of founders look to that and saying that is the epitome, that's the ultimate success. Like, so I might be a light version of that now, but I have to go there, and I don't think that's necessarily true. I think sometimes you might be that type, but you can be another type, and so like I think like finding out what really works for you and how do you make things happen to the largest extent, and also do you want to, right? Like, there can be a comfort level that means you don't have to be a $1 trillion company. You could maybe just build a unicorn and that's fine.
Absolutely. But it's also like, I mean, I see it a little bit like in a competitive space, because if you're trying to do everything perfect and also things you don't like, how competitive are you as a person, right?
No, you're absolutely right.
I think like your idea of like really building that fantastic team, so to say, is for me actually a role in my whole life. Like I'm trying to do it in my private life with my kids, and I mean in my company, wherever. I mean, like even in my household, I'm saying like I'm actually not that good in some ways, but I can do A, B, Z. Why should I do that?
You're so right. I mean, you're so right. And I feel for me, I had to learn that. I had to learn delegating. I had to learn a bunch of things, right? And that changed over time. And then like from a strictly professional, like sort of what I lean into today, it's ecosystem and platform place, right? I love the notion of seeing, hey, there's someone doing something here and something here, but if you add them up, then the sum of those parts is going to be greater, right? And like so like that's a very sort of primary driver. I rarely go into spearheading things, right? I like things that it might have a spearhead, but the potential play is different, right? I'm just naturally drawn to platform and ecosystem plays. Like that's the category creation, that stuff like that is just, it's so much fun. And I love being a little like, I'd rather like, there's many great businesses that went in and found a city and then got a slice of it, right? And then hey, this already exists, but there's not an open source version of it. Let's fucking go, right? Okay, great. It's awesome. I'd much rather sit outside the city walls and say, okay, I have an anthill here, but we own that anthill. Let's grow that into a city, right? And so like that notion is more fun. I feel like I like that. I like the ecosystem place, and I just learned that about myself. And I think for the rest of my career, that's what I'm gonna be leaning into.
You have many years left, as
I hope so.
we just heard. You're 19, so um, and I think, what is really, let's say, absolutely unique about you is that I would say that there are not many successful founders who really have fun and deep joy in what they're doing. I do see a lot of very successful people, but not everyone seems as if they're able to, so to say, cope with their challenges, the stress, and maybe even their own discipline and power with what they drive their lives. And sometimes it feels they are having too much focus and energy to drive towards amazing stuff, but maybe they don't enjoy it that much. So and that's really truly unique, and I would say a huge accomplishment. So therefore, thank you so much telling us about that.
No, for sure. And I just add for anyone like it being a founder, obviously sometimes it's a struggle, right? It just is. And like you shouldn't, if you feel like, oh, today was really hard and so was yesterday, let me abandon ship. Don't be a founder, right? Like it's not because it won't be hard. I just meant like in principle with over time, you know, doubling down on what you're really good at is not necessarily a pathway forward. That's all I meant.
No, but hopefully it didn't come over wrongly, because that's exactly also what I mean. I mean, like this deep joy of learning and the deep joy of finding always what's next in the world, which drives you, and maybe not the ego of, let's say, how cool you are or how big or what other people think about what you accomplished, but this, and I think that makes a big difference, because you do it truly for yourself and not for others, and at least I can see that from the outside, and I think it's a beautiful thing to see. So
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much,
thank you so
Frislio.
much.
Always fun to catch up. And yeah, we haven't done one of these together before, so that was fun.
Exactly, absolutely. But I hope I see you soon back in Iceland. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Beautiful place.
exactly. Perfect.